My name is Ashley Brayman, and I am here today to talk about the female athlete triad and its prevalence in gymnastics. All right, so first things first, females in sport have increased over time. The prevalence of females in 1971 was 310,000. In 2010, that number increased to 3,373,000. Why? Because of Title X. Title X came into effect in 1972, and it was legislature put into place to kind of avoid or eliminate the level of discrimination against females in federally funded educational activities. So obviously, due to an increased number of females in sports, there has been an increase in injuries and other things that are related to females being in sport. As a result of this, the female athlete triad came about. The female athlete triad is a syndrome observed in female athletes presenting with disordered eating, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis. Over time, this definition has changed, and it's become more of a spectrum disorder, and the criteria has changed a little bit. So formerly it was disordered eating, now it's optimal energy or energy availability, and menstrual dysfunction or menstrual disorders, as well as optimal bone health. So the criteria has become a little bit more lenient. So the components of the female athlete triad, as I said, are eating disorders and energy availability, menstrual dysfunction, and bone density loss. So some of the components that fall under energy availability include anorexia, bulimia, and other eating disorders. Because formerly, in order to meet the criteria for the female athlete triad, you had to have all three of the disorders. Now that's changed. Like I said, it's more of a spectrum and an umbrella type situation. And so a lot of people weren't meeting the specific DSM criteria for anorexia and bulimia. However, they did show symptoms of either or, which kind of eliminated their ability to be classified as having the female athlete triad. So there's certain risk factors involved for the female athlete triad. Those risk factors are sport specific, so sports that are individualized, sports that focus on body shape, body type, sports that have a judged appearance. The norm is low body weight, aesthetic sports like dance or gymnastics. So there's certain, like I said, certain sports that are it's more common for a female to show some of these symptoms. Those sports include gymnastics, both artistic and rhythmic, dance, synchronized swimming, martial arts, diving, dance, figure skating, distance running, all those sports that you think of people that are lean and small and built, those different criteria that they must meet. Because the cornerstone of the female athlete triad is disordered eating, which plays into how you look and how you feel, and everything else kind of falls under that. So gymnastics criteria and application. Obviously, gymnastics is very physically strenuous. They're kind of militant at times. There's long hours of practice. Body image ideals are huge. Dieting is a big thing. It's success focused, and your prime training occurs during childhood and adolescence when you're most vulnerable to developing different eating disorders and certain things that can either make you or break you later in life. So, moving on. Let's see. In terms of prevalence, low energy availability prevalence in gymnasts. So 62% of collegiate gymnasts show disordered eating behaviors. It's a huge number. 32.4% of elite female gymnasts have an eating disorder. Like I said before, the criteria for an eating disorder is super specific. And 32.4% of female elite gymnasts meet that diagnostic criteria. So adverse effects of low energy availability or disordered eating may lead to overtraining, chronic fatigue, impaired athletic performance, and increased injury risk. It also affects hormones. Hormones are huge in females. So hormones including insulin secretion, cortisol, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, leptin, substrates like glucose, fatty acids, and ketones. This, in turn, leads to menstrual dysfunction, which is our next topic, irreversible bone loss, which is another topic, and psychological complications including depression, low self-esteem, fluid and electrolyte imbalances, and impairments in renal, cardiovascular, endocrine, gastrointestinal, immune, and thermoregulatory systems. So just that one component, there's so many other things that fall under that. So menstrual disorders, the prevalence of those in gymnastics. By age 14, only 20% of gymnasts have gotten their first period, which in the general population, girls, especially today, typically get their first menstrual cycle much younger than that. 47% showed oligomenorrhea, and 35% showed amenorrhea, which is either a complete stoppage of having a period or having a menstrual cycle that goes longer than 35 days, which typically is about 28, give or take. So obviously the deficiency of those hormones that cause females to have a period or to reach menarche in the first place can lead to bone mineral density loss. And that also is connected to impaired cell function and elevated levels of LDL cholesterol. So moving on to our next component, bone density. Bone density and injury prevalence. So there's a study that found that gymnasts actually have higher bone density than a typical female of the same age. The study concluded that because of the increased pressure that gymnasts put on their bodies, their bodies kind of adapt to that. But when you add in the eating disorders and everything else, that extra bone density is not a protective factor against injury. So 78% of musculoskeletal injuries in females occur in these aesthetic sports like gymnastics. The adverse effects of that are higher, like I said, they have a higher bone mineral density, but it's not protective against injury when hormone levels are not stable. Wolff's Law basically explains that, which is increase in bone density due to increase in force and pressure on specific areas. And females will lose up to 35% of cortical bone and 50% of trabecular bone throughout their lifetime, just based on hormones and fluctuations with that in general. So conclusions and overall prevalence. Conclusions and practical applications. The overall prevalence of the female athlete triad it varies. So if you're looking at all three components, you'll see up to 16% of high school, collegiate, or elite athletes. Two components, the number grows a little bit, from up to 27%. And then if you look at just one component, that number goes up to 60% in female high school, collegiate, and elite athletes. 78% of all athletes have at least one component, so that's all age ranges and all levels as well. So the reason that I chose the female athlete triad in gymnastics is for a couple of different reasons. So the female athlete triad is not completely well known. There's a lack of knowledge. So a 2006 study showed that 64% of coaches were aware that the triad existed, but only 43% could name the components of the triad. A separate survey of athletic trainers, PTs, coaches, and physicians showed that only half were able to name the components, and 48% of physicians could name all three. In these types of professions, it's hugely important that people are able to know and understand the different components, especially with how much prevalence. I mean, we're just looking at one sport here. So obviously with different components and different aspects of this disorder, there's increased risks for injury. So bone injury risk goes from 15 to 21% when one component is present, 21 to 30% when two components are present, and then 29 to 60% when all three factors are present. That's huge. So, like I mentioned, there's a lack of knowledge by professionals, and if there's a lack of knowledge by professionals, there's a lack of knowledge in the general population and the athletes. So in order to prevent the prevalence of the female athlete triad, people need to be educated on the topic. People need to be educated on eating disorders and what the proper amount of carbs, fats, proteins that someone needs to thrive, especially as a competitive gymnast. Healthy eating, it needs to be focused on. Injury prevention. Most injuries are a result of improper warm-up, improper techniques. These things are easily prevented through proper training. As I mentioned, I have a personal connection to the female athlete triad in gymnastics. I was a competitive gymnast for the vast majority of my life. I competed from the time I was 7 till I was 14 until injuries kind of pulled me out of it. Then I went back and competed from 20 to 22. So gymnastics has been a huge part of my life. However, as a result of gymnastics and being a competitive gymnast, there's certain obstacles that I've had to overcome throughout my life. Body image, that's definitely been something that's been in the back of my mind. I've never necessarily had an eating disorder per se or met diagnostic criteria, but there's definitely been times where coaches were like, you need to be stronger, you need to be leaner. I've definitely heard them say that to other girls that I competed with and stuff like that. So there's that. Also, I've suffered a lot of injuries as a result of gymnastics for various reasons. Bone issues, I have arthritis, I've had that since I was 14, tendonitis, different issues like that. I never actually, I never broke a bone as a result of gymnastics, but it's definitely been a struggle being a gymnast, and that could be a lack of proper training, proper warm-up. It could be numerous different things. There's different personality traits that are kind of common with the female athlete triad. Being a perfectionist is one of them. There's a lot of gymnasts out there that are perfectionists. Unfortunately, I kind of took on that trait as well. So as a result of all of this, I think it's really important that we focus on the culture of gymnastics and kind of changing some of that for the future. We focus less on perfectionism, focus more on health, focus on building strength and coordination for young gymnasts as opposed to perfect lines and perfect double backs and certain things like that that are not important when you're 7 years old. So in my life, I have coached gymnastics, I don't know, for quite some time. And my way of kind of helping these girls and hopefully reducing the prevalence of the triad in gymnastics is to kind of be more of a cheerleader for these girls, to support them in everything that they do, to be someone that they can trust, someone that's not going to say, hey, you shouldn't have that cupcake. Actually, I've brought cupcakes and candy to my gymnasts. I think that gymnastics needs to be a little bit more fun. Not everyone is going to make it to the Olympics. Growing up, I was trained like I was going to the Olympics. At 12 years old, I was in the gym, 16 hours a week. And that's at 12 years old. So these things certainly need to change. The culture of gymnastics needs to get a little less strict, I think, in terms of training everyone for the Olympics, because it's just not feasible, and it turns people away. And as a coach, I've seen that. I've seen girls be turned away from gymnastics, and it's something I loved growing up, regardless of everything else that came about. So I'm really passionate about kind of working with people and working with girls to train them, to teach them the positive side of gymnastics and kind of shelter them from the negative effects. So I want to thank you for listening and have a great day.